He's 58, but I've never felt so young and powerless. His gaze, his voice, they were the key that unlocked doors to my deepest, most hidden desires. I never thought things would go this far. Robert was always just a family friend. Calm, composed, with a confidence that only older men seem to have. He was the kind of man who always carried himself with quiet authority. My mom trusted him. I trusted him. He was Uncle Robert to me, a permanent fixture in our lives, someone reliable and safe. But that night, everything changed. It started so simply. My mom had called me from work, apologizing for running late again. "Just keep Robert company," she said, her voice hurried. "He's such a sweetheart, and I'm sure you two will get along fine until I'm home." At first, I didn't think much of it. Robert was sitting in our living room, sipping tea and flipping through a book he'd brought. It seemed like any other evening. But when I walked into the room, his eyes met mine, and something about the way he looked at me felt different. "You're so quiet tonight, Alicia," he said, his tone soft but probing. He put the book down and adjusted his glasses, his gaze settling on me like he was studying something he didn't fully understand. "I guess I've just been lost in my own head," I replied, forcing a smile. But the truth was, my thoughts had started to drift the moment I saw him. Robert leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering as if he was about to share a secret. "You know, Alicia, when I was younger, I thought I understood everything about women. But age, it teaches you things. It teaches you how to see beauty in what a woman doesn't even realize about herself." My heart skipped a beat. The way he spoke, it wasn't just about me, and yet, it felt like it was only for me. "You're full of thoughts tonight, aren't you?" he added, his tone light but with an edge that sent shivers down my spine. I felt my cheeks heat up. "It's nothing important," I mumbled, avoiding his gaze. But he didn't look away. "You shouldn't dismiss your thoughts so quickly," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Sometimes, the things we try to ignore are the most important." His words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to shake off. I sat down on the chair across from him, suddenly hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. The room felt smaller, the silence between us louder. "Your mom tells me you've been working hard lately," he said, breaking the tension. "You deserve a break." "I guess," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head slightly, studying me again. "You don't give yourself enough credit, do you? You're smart, talented, beautiful." That last word hung in the air, echoing louder in my mind than anything else he'd said. I looked up at him, unsure how to respond. Was this just a casual compliment, or something more? "Robert," I started, but the way he was looking at me made the rest of my words disappear. He leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable," he said, though there was a confidence in his tone that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. "No, it's fine," I said quickly, my voice cracking just slightly. But it wasn't fine. Not really. There was something electric in the air, something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. "Good," he said simply, picking up his tea again. But his eyes never left mine. For the next hour, we talked about everything and nothing. His life, his travels, his advice about things I hadn't even thought about. He had this way of speaking that drew me in, making every word feel important. But beneath it all, there was an undercurrent I couldn't deny. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. The pauses, the looks, the slight inflections in his voice that made my heart race. At one point, he leaned forward again, resting his elbow on the arm of his chair. "Can I ask you something, Alicia?" "Of course," I said, though my voice felt unsteady. "Have you ever felt like you're holding yourself back?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes were intense. "Like there's something inside you that's waiting to be seen, but you're too afraid to let it out?" I froze, unsure how to answer. His question wasn't just about me. It was about everything I'd been feeling lately but hadn't admitted to myself. I don't know," I stammered. He smiled softly, leaning back again. "That's the thing about life, Alicia. Sometimes it takes someone else to show you what you can't see in yourself." His words lingered long after the conversation moved on. Even as the clock ticked closer to midnight and I knew my mom would be home soon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. It wasn't just his words. It was his presence, calm, steady, and yet so magnetic. It pulled me in, made me want to stay close, even though my instincts told me to run. And as I sat there, listening to him talk about things that seemed so ordinary on the surface, I couldn't stop wondering what he was really thinking. What was he waiting for? What was he hoping I'd say? I didn't know it yet, but that night was just the beginning. And what happened next? I wasn't ready for it. His words seemed simple, but I could feel the deeper meanings hidden beneath them, ones I was too afraid to understand. It felt wrong, or maybe too right. He moved closer, his knee brushing against mine, not intentionally, but not entirely by accident either. I should have shifted away, created space, but I didn't. That small contact, so insignificant in theory, felt like a spark in a room full of gasoline. "Alicia," he said softly, his voice dropping into a tone that was almost a whisper, "have you ever thought about what might happen if we didn't confine ourselves to rules? What life could be like if we just let go?" I froze. My first instinct was to laugh it off, to turn this into some kind of harmless joke. But the laugh never came. His gaze, so steady and unyielding, made it impossible to pretend this was nothing. He wasn't joking. My voice faltered, the words catching in my throat. "Robert, this." I began, trying to fill the air with something that would break the tension, but before I could finish, his hand settled on mine. The weight of that touch silenced me. It wasn't just the physical contact, it was the way it lingered, firm yet gentle, a silent question he didn't need to voice. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, his voice so low it felt like it was reverberating inside me. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to pull away, to tell him he was wrong. But my body betrayed me. I didn't move. I couldn't. "Robert," I whispered, finally finding my voice, though it sounded foreign and shaky. This isn't right." His lips curled into a small, knowing smile, but his hand didn't leave mine. "Right or wrong doesn't matter as much as what's real," he replied. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Every second stretched, the silence between us thick with unspoken words and unacknowledged truths. "You're young, Alicia. Beautiful, smart, full of life," he said, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand. "You probably don't even realize how incredible you are. But I see it. I've always seen it." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "You can't say things like that," I managed, though my voice betrayed how unsure I was. "Why not?" he asked simply, his eyes never leaving mine. "Because it's—" I couldn't finish the sentence. What was I supposed to say? Because it's wrong? Because it's confusing? Because it's exactly what I didn't know I wanted to hear? He shifted slightly, leaning closer. His proximity was intoxicating, and I hated how much I noticed the small details, the faint lines around his eyes, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way his breath felt warm against my skin. "We're just talking," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "And talking isn't wrong, is it?" "No," I admitted reluctantly. "And what if I told you that you could trust me?" he continued. "That I would never push you into something you didn't want? But that I see a part of you you're afraid to show anyone else?" I blinked, his words slicing through the fog in my mind. "I don't know what you mean," I lied, though we both knew I understood perfectly. He tilted his head, studying me with a look that felt like he was peeling back every layer I'd built to protect myself. "I think you do," he said quietly. The tension in the room was unbearable. I needed to break it, to regain some sense of control. But every time I opened my mouth to speak, his presence overwhelmed me. "Alicia," he said again, his voice dropping even lower. "What's stopping you? Fear? Guilt? Or is it something else?" I bit my lip, my hands trembling under his steady gaze. "You're making this sound simple," I said, my voice almost a whisper. "It is simple," he said, leaning back slightly but never breaking eye contact. "We complicate things because we're afraid of what might happen if we don't. But I think you're stronger than that. I think you're braver than you realize." His words sent a chill down my spine, not because they were wrong, but because they were too close to the truth. "This isn't fair," I said finally, trying to summon some kind of protest. "Fairness has nothing to do with it," he replied. "This is about being honest. And I think you've been holding back for a long time." He leaned forward again, his hand moving slightly, brushing against mine in a way that felt both deliberate and accidental. "But you don't have to hold back with me," he said. I looked at him, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I forgot about everything, my mom, the world outside this room, even the voice in my head screaming at me to stop. I don't. I started, but he interrupted me. You don't have to say anything, he said softly. Just don't run away. And I didn't. I stayed frozen in place, caught between the part of me that knew this was wrong and the part that didn't care. You're overthinking it, he said, his voice gentle but firm. Just let yourself feel. His words settled over me like a blanket, warm and suffocating at the same time. I wanted to argue, to push him away, but the truth was, I didn't want him to stop. The silence between us grew heavier, the unspoken tension threatening to swallow me whole. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I knew that I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't come back from. You have no idea how beautiful you are when you're not afraid, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound of his words, the feel of his hand on mine, the weight of his gaze. But it was useless. Robert, Shoo, he said gently, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. You don't have to say anything. Just be here with me. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to get up, to leave, to put as much distance between us as possible. But my body wouldn't move. And in that moment, I knew I'd already crossed the line. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But his touch spoke louder than any words ever could. His hand lingered on mine, warm and steady, as if it belonged there. Alicia, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken truths. Do you ever wonder how many chances we let slip away because we're afraid to take them? I felt my throat tighten. His words felt too personal, too precise, as if he knew exactly what was going through my mind. This isn't right, I whispered, barely able to form the words. But even as I said it, the conviction in my voice wavered. Isn't it? His eyes met mine, unwavering and intent. What's truly wrong is ignoring what's real, what's in front of you. What you feel. I should have pulled away. I should have said something definitive, something that would end this moment before it unraveled further. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself frozen, caught between the pull of his presence and the voice in my head screaming at me to leave. You're overthinking, he said, as if he could read my thoughts. His thumb gently brushed over my hand, sending a shiver up my arm. Sometimes, Alicia, the simplest truth is the hardest to accept. I couldn't look away. His voice was calm, his expression composed, but there was something undeniable in the way he looked at me, something that made my heart race and my resolve weaken. Why are you saying this? I asked, my voice trembling. Because you need to hear it, he replied. You spend so much time trying to be what everyone expects of you. But when was the last time you asked yourself what you want? His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I had no answer. He leaned in slightly, his face now inches from mine. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the quiet power in his proximity. If you want me to stop, just say the word, he murmured. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and charged. My breath quickened as his hand moved, slowly tracing the line of my wrist before pulling away, leaving my skin tingling in its absence. You feel it too, don't you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to say no, to laugh it off, to run. But the truth was, I couldn't lie, not to him, not to myself. I don't know what I feel, I admitted, my voice breaking. He smiled faintly, a mixture of understanding and something deeper. That's okay, he said. But don't ignore it. You deserve more than that. I hated how his words made sense, how they stirred something inside me I didn't want to confront. I hated how much I wanted to stay, to see where this was going, even though every rational part of me screamed to walk away. Robert. I began, but he shook his head. You don't have to say anything, he said. Just let yourself feel. That's all I'm asking. His hand moved again, this time brushing against my cheek. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me. My eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment, I let myself sink into the sensation, into the quiet intimacy of the moment. When I opened my eyes, he was watching me, his expression unreadable but intense. You're so beautiful, he said, and for the first time, I believed it, not because of the words, but because of the way he said them. I felt my defenses crumbling, piece by piece. Every line I'd drawn, every boundary I'd tried to maintain, felt insignificant in the face of his quiet persistence. You make it sound so simple, I said, my voice barely audible. It is, he replied. We complicate things because we're afraid. But the truth is always simple. His hand lingered on my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin with a tenderness that made my chest ache. I knew I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't undo, but I couldn't bring myself to step back. I don't know if I can do this, I said, my voice trembling. You don't have to decide right now, he said. Just don't run away from it. From me. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Every breath I took felt like a decision, every moment a test of willpower I wasn't sure I had. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I saw not just the family friend or the older man I'd always known, but someone who saw me in a way no one else ever had. And that terrified me. But it also thrilled me. You're making this impossible, I said, a weak attempt at deflection. He smiled, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. No, Alicia, he said. I'm making it possible. His words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. I knew this would change everything. But the moment I let it happen, there was no going back. His hand moved gently across my cheek, his touch impossibly soft. My eyes shut instinctively, my body betraying every thought screaming in my mind to stop this. You're so beautiful when you stop being afraid, he whispered, his breath warm against my skin. The words sank into me, pulling me further into the moment I couldn't escape. A shiver ran through me, starting at the base of my neck and cascading downward, leaving my thoughts scrambled. His words weren't just flattering, they were intentional, deliberate. He knew what he was doing. He knew the effect he had on me. And worse, he knew I wasn't resisting. I should have moved, should have broken the spell he was weaving with every look, every touch. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, my chest rising and falling with shallow breaths as he closed the space between us. This isn't just me, he murmured, his fingers brushing against my jawline. You feel it too. Don't you? I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. My thoughts were a blur, a chaotic mess of emotions I couldn't untangle. All I could do was nod, a barely perceptible motion that seemed to be all the confirmation he needed. His hand slid lower, resting just below my chin as he tilted my head upward, forcing me to meet his eyes. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice low and steady. If you want me to stop, just say the word. But I didn't. Instead, I felt myself leaning into his touch, my body moving before my mind could catch up. His lips hovered near mine, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I can't. I whispered, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. You can, he said firmly, his gaze locking onto mine. But you don't want to. And he was right. In that instant, the weight of every unspoken rule, every line I thought I could never cross, fell away. All that mattered was the moment, the closeness, the pull that had been building between us all night. When his lips finally met mine, it wasn't tentative or hesitant. It was certain, as if he had been waiting for this just as much as I had. The kiss was soft at first, a slow exploration, but it quickly deepened, becoming something I couldn't control, something neither of us could stop. His hand moved to the back of my neck, pulling me closer as my own hands found their way to his chest. The warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips sent another wave of shivers through me. Every rational thought I had left was drowned out by the intensity of the moment. I could feel the tension in his body, the restraint he was barely holding on to. Alicia, he murmured against my lips, his voice a mix of desire and hesitation. This is... Don't stop, I interrupted, surprising even myself with the urgency in my voice. The look he gave me then was something I'd never forget, a mix of hunger and disbelief, as if he couldn't quite believe I was saying it. But he didn't need to be told twice. His hands moved with a new purpose, tracing the curve of my shoulders, the line of my back. Every touch felt deliberate, like he was memorizing the moment, committing it to memory in case it slipped away. The world outside the room seemed to disappear, the weight of what we were doing drowned out by the sheer intensity of the connection we shared. Every breath, every touch, every look felt like it carried a lifetime of meaning. But even in the heat of the moment, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered warnings. What are you doing? This is too far. This is wrong. I silenced it. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I wasn't thinking about consequences or rules or expectations. I was just there, fully present, letting myself feel everything I had been too scared to acknowledge before. The moments stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. His hands were steady, his movements sure, but there was a tenderness in the way he held me, a care that made it impossible to doubt his sincerity. When he pulled back slightly, just enough to look into my eyes, I saw something there that caught me off guard. It wasn't just desire, it was something deeper, something that made my chest tighten. "You're incredible," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't know how to respond. Words felt meaningless in the face of what we were sharing. So instead, I leaned in again, closing the distance between us. Every part of me was drawn to him, as if I'd been waiting for this without even realizing it. And as the night went on, I knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. That night, I learned more about myself than I ever had in my entire life. But the morning brought feelings I wasn't ready for. His hand brushed against mine, the touch so light, yet it sent a ripple through me like a pebble dropped in still water. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. The silence between us was thick, heavy, almost suffocating, but neither of us dared to break it. He leaned closer, his warmth enveloping me, his movements slow, unhurried, deliberate. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic. It was careful, measured, as if he was giving me every chance to stop this, to pull back and end it. But I didn't. "You're incredible," he said softly, his voice steady, almost reverent. His words weren't rushed or hollow, they carried weight. My chest tightened as his words sunk in. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was the moment to walk away, to step back and draw the line I knew we couldn't cross. But I didn't move. I stayed frozen, my body betraying every thought in my mind. His hand slid gently along my arm, his touch slow, purposeful. He paused just below my shoulder, his fingers barely grazing my skin. My breath hitched, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, thicker. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out any coherent thoughts. "You don't have to be afraid," he said quietly. His tone was calm, steady, reassuring in a way that made me believe him, even when I knew I shouldn't. I lifted my eyes to meet his, truly looking at him for what felt like the first time. His gaze wasn't just on me, it was in me, piercing through every layer I'd built to keep the world out. In that moment, it was as though the world outside didn't exist. There was no past, no future, just this moment, suspended in time, where it was only us. He reached out again, his hand brushing against my jaw before settling gently at my collarbone. His touch was light but deliberate, like he was savoring every second, every inch of space between us. "You deserve to feel this," he murmured, his words soft but firm, carrying a conviction that left no room for doubt. I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet hum that started in my chest and radiated outward, making it impossible to think, impossible to reason. There was no room for logic anymore, no space for questions or hesitation. Every touch, every word, seemed to draw me further into a place I knew I shouldn't be but couldn't bring myself to leave. Time slowed as his hands moved with a quiet confidence, tracing the edge of boundaries that no longer seemed to exist. The line we had danced around all night was gone, erased by the weight of the moment, by the gravity of what was happening. And then it happened. There were no words, no hesitation, no second-guessing. It was unspoken, undeniable. The warmth of his touch, the weight of his presence, it consumed me completely. When it was over, we sat there in the stillness, the silence between us heavy with everything we couldn't say. I felt the gravity of what had just happened, the way it had shifted the world beneath my feet. Nothing felt the same. He turned to me, his expression soft but serious, his voice barely above a whisper. "Alicia, you're extraordinary. I hope you know that." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle: guilt, fear, exhilaration, and something else, something I wasn't ready to name. The silence stretched on as I tried to process it all, tried to make sense of what we had just done, what it meant, and what it would mean going forward. The next morning, the house was quiet when I woke up. The sunlight streaming through the window felt too bright, too real. I sat up slowly, the events of the night before replaying in my mind with a clarity that was both painful and intoxicating. I pulled on my robe and made my way downstairs, my heart pounding as I heard the soft hum of my mom's voice from the kitchen. The smell of coffee and pancakes filled the air, grounding me in a reality that felt miles away from where I'd been just hours ago. She was at the stove, her back to me, humming a cheerful tune as she flipped pancakes. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said brightly, not even glancing over her shoulder. "How was your evening with Robert?" Her question hit me like a tidal wave. My stomach twisted, my chest tightening as I forced myself to find words. "It was fine," I said finally, my voice barely steady. She nodded, her focus still on the stove. "He's such a good man," she added with a smile. I couldn't meet her eyes. I sat down at the table, staring blankly at the plate she placed in front of me. The weight of the night before pressed down on me, each moment replaying in my mind with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. And yet, as I sat there, I couldn't help but feel different. The guilt was there, yes, but so was something else. Something I didn't want to admit, even to myself. Part of me didn't regret it. Part of me wondered if I ever could. And now, as I sit here, replaying it all in my mind, I'm left with a question I can't answer alone. Was it a mistake? Or was it just inevitable? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Would you have walked away, or stayed like I did? Because even now, I'm not sure if it was right, but it felt real. And just like that, it's over. Or maybe it's just beginning.